Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. This is the third Food Effective Life webinar in the series. Very good of you to give up your time and come along and join us tonight. If you are using the chat box and you want people to see what you're typing, please make sure where it's got the word to, please make sure it's set to all panelists and attendees, and then everybody can then actually see what you're typing. So thank you very much. That's the first bit of housekeeping. The second bit is just really to let you know that we're actually recording the webinar this evening. The webinar will be available eventually on our Food Effective Life website, and as many of you know, that's just recently been updated. If you do have questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll answer them at the end. My colleague Francis should be online to help with those questioning this evening. But again, please make sure that where it says to is set to all panelists and attendees. That's quite important. When we come to the end of the webinar this evening, you'll be prompted to click close. When you click close, you'll be redirected to a very, very short online evaluation, just so we can get some feedback about this evening. And then once you finish that, it will then automatically bring up your certificate of attendance, which of course you can use for your professional development sort of portfolio. So thanks ever so much for joining us. My name's Roy Ballum, and I'm the Managing Director and Head of Education at the British Nutrition Foundation. And we're delighted to bring you this webinar this evening all around schemes of work and lesson plans. And it's something that we often talk about at teacher meets with initial teacher trainers, as well as more experienced teachers too. And it's just something that we thought we'd have an update on, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, or we can get new ideas, new learning to go forward with. So really this evening, the objectives which were listed on the Eventbrite page when you booked was that we're going to use the national curriculum in England as an example, because I appreciate some of you may be from Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, just to look at the importance of, when we're planning schemes of work, to look at progression, differentiation, stretch and challenge, but really looking at that learning journey going throughout. And we're going to be looking at progression from 5 to 14 years as we go through, developing that scheme of work, looking at different pedagogy, particularly then focusing on Bloom's taxonomy, and then links to the Food Effective Life resources, plus lastly, suggestions for further reading and sources of information. So where do we start when we're looking at schemes of work? Well, I always think it's a bit like Russian dolls, because we start off with the national curriculum or competencies, and then we move down to schemes of work, which set out our stall for a whole year, and then we move on to individual lesson plans, and then we actually get into the physical lesson, and then we go into the minutiae. So starting from the whole, we move down very gradually, more and more, getting more and more focused as we go down there to the absolute individual lesson. So what does this mean for us? So we have the curriculum, which sets out that knowledge and skills. And in the national curriculum for England, there is some form of progression, although that does need unpacking as we go through. And we'll talk about a bit more about that in a moment. We then have the curriculum as its entirety. Then we have key stages, which then give us indications of prior learning and experiences. We then go into individual years, where we split content of teaching to look at that progression. We then have those schemes of work, which set out those aims for the year and those different learning outcomes. We then focus on those individual lessons and what those are effective, where we show progress and look at differentiation. And then, of course, we look into the classroom itself. And that's where we would hope that loop goes back and we look at evaluation and perhaps feedback, and perhaps pupil voice comes in here too. So we've got that loop going round. And of course, occasionally we loop right the way around when we have a new curriculum, for example, or perhaps if you are thinking about this from a qualification perspective, then you would use the same sort of flow chart as you go round. So really, again, taking that analogy, we're doing a helicopter view of curriculum, and then what we would then do is then zoom straight into kind of the minutiae. So imagine that was the Thames, and we're focusing right down onto that little boat just right there. So just so always imagine that when you're planning schemes of work. So when we're looking at cooking and nutrition from the national curriculum, we're really looking at sort of that top line progression to begin with. So here we can see that we've got Key Stage 1, and there are 2 key bullets that are listed there. And what's interesting is those 2 bullets represent 2 or 3 years of work. Then we have Key Stage 2, building on that. And then we move to Key Stage 3. And I appreciate most of the teachers online tonight are secondary from our profiling, but we know that we do have people from other key stages and in fact early years too. So we have early years curriculum which builds and up into Key Stage 1. And of course from Key Stage 3, we move on to GCSE. And you can see here, there are key elements of progression that are listed and some clues on how we unpack this to help support as we go through. So the unpacking is an important issue. So what do we mean by unpacking the curriculum? So what do those statements, which I've just listed there, kind of mean over time? So if we've got Key Stage 3, it should be about 3 years, although many schools, it's actually only 2 years, because year 9 is kind of like a bit of a precursor to level 1 or 2 hospitality and catering or GCSE work. So it's what do those 2 or 3 sentences unpack and become over time to get lessons, maybe 50, 60 lessons over a time period. And then what as a teacher do we believe are the kind of key knowledge and skills that need to be included over that time period? And once we've identified those key knowledge and skills, what are those building blocks? What are the concepts that we're trying to build? And how does that go, for example, from Key Stage 1 through to Key Stage 3, let alone just within a single Key Stage 2? So what are those things, which we're going to have a look at and try and address in a moment? And once we've got those building blocks, those concepts, do we give a certain emphasis of some of those in different years or different time periods? So would we do more work on healthy eating perhaps than where food comes from? Does that change over the life course of a scheme of work, or do we focus on a particular year? So those are interesting concepts we need to think about. And also, how do we show that progression once we've identified those key concepts? Here's an example which is from a music school, which I think is really quite interesting to look at. And this is here showing progression from a year 1 through to year 6. And what they've done is at the bottom there, you can see, is that they've identified all sort of the key concepts that they wish to cover. But equally, if you look at the little pie charts next to the years, there's also an indication on the emphasis of some of those key concepts as we go through. So if we think about this from a food point of view, we can actually think about what are the food building blocks for a scheme of work and lessons. And here's just a few bullets that I've put together. And perhaps if you've got any other thoughts, you could type in the chat box here. But perhaps our building blocks are around healthy eating, cooking, provenance. Maybe there's more about provenance that we wish to explore. Safety, and I think food safety, food hygiene are key things. And of course, if you look at the national curriculum, there's no mention of food hygiene within that. So that's a key one that we need to always remember in the back of our minds. Consumer awareness is quite generic. So what does that mean? There are many things that could absolutely go through. So that might be issues to do with food labeling, food choice, for example. So there are interesting things that we go through here. But what other things might there be? And that's up to you to decide. But I think this is an interesting way to think about key concepts and how we build them into lessons, and the propulsion, the emphasis that we place as we go through. So haven't we done this sort of thing before? Just taking key stage 3 as a consideration here. Here are those 4 bullets that we looked at a few slides ago when we were looking at key stage 1 through to key stage 3. Well, we do that kind of issue from the previous chart, hopefully all the time, where we're looking at understanding and applying the principles of nutrition through year 7, year 8, and through year 9. And we're building on that. We're building on those key concepts as we go through. And in my day, it was called something like a spiral curriculum as you go through. So we go through and we kind of introduce, or perhaps we reinforce concepts from a previous key stage, prior learning. We look at issues to do with consolidation and remembering and applying as we go through. And perhaps then we go through and look at extending those things too. And thank you, Janet, there for issues to do perhaps with food waste, or how do we use food leftovers, or perhaps we have aspects to do with food recycling. So these are all key things, and it might be slightly different nuance in different schools. And I think we all need to play to our strengths on those sorts of things. So perhaps there's already some form of this spiral curriculum we're building, we're scaffolding up the learning as we go through. So when we're thinking about schemes of work, then there are a number of questions that we need to ask ourselves as we go through. So really about what that learning that is in there that must take place over those key stages. So we've got the national curriculum, and we've also got the core food competencies from government that we could also use. What about those other elements that are not explicitly mentioned in the curriculum? And I've mentioned food safety and hygiene, and Janet there's mentioned food waste, for example. What learning can we easily break down over the years? What actually differentiates each year? Because obviously it's broken down onto children's age, but that's not usually or sometimes an indication of pupil ability. So we need to consider that too. We need to build on previous relevant knowledge from year to year, so that prior learning. We also need to consider in our subject the amount of practical work. I mean, I've put the word required, but what we would like to see going in there. And perhaps often practical work is a useful way to look at many other aspects of food. So for example, food science, for example. So what's the balance on this as we go through? What about the format of or expectations from your school? What a scheme of work looks like? Some people have very detailed schemes of work. Others are less so. There's no kind of golden rule, and it really needs to make sure that it fits your school, your ethos of your school as we go through. So that's a key thing too. And then we also need to get how much detail you want to provide. One of the things I've already mentioned is also thinking about pupil voice and how that is considered. And that might be through that feedback loop within lessons. It might be when people join the school. But obviously, we need to think about pupil voice and what's their expectation of their food education. It's probably very different from my day when I did O-level food and nutrition, and the sorts of things, perhaps the recipes that I made and the kind of references that my teacher used, and the application of nutrition may well have changed over time. Lastly, we need to also think about your knowledge and skills. And that's why we have these webinars and a knowledge centre now on the Food Effective Life website. This might play a key determinant too about what you cover and in what depth and what skills perhaps that you look at. So, for example, some of you might be qualified nutritionists and enjoy cooking and can cook. Equally, we might have people that are trained chefs, so very high skills in practical work, and perhaps would need some more support, for example, in food science. Just as an example, it's not always the case, but we just need to be honest to ourselves and think about how we audit our own training, and then identify how we can sort of fill the gaps as we go through. So let's think about those key concepts that I've touched upon earlier. So here are 3 statements from the national curriculum all around essentially where food comes from. So we've got key stage 1, 2 and 3. And I think putting it in this format, you can really start to see some very simple form of progression going through the key stages. And of course, what we need to try and do is to unpack these even more. This is not the answer, but for example, it could be about introducing the concept that all food comes from plants and animals, that there are origins, that food has origins and it's grown in different seasons, perhaps in different countries. That there is some very simple food production and processing of that food. So where does milk come from? Where does bread come from? So taking some very basic food commodities and going back to the absolute origin and moving that forward. And of course, that would depend on the age and ability of the pupils that you're teaching. Perhaps there's some form of introducing some quality, some standards and different types of production as we go through. And as we build this up through the key stages and look at those key concepts, it's also about the consequences of our choice and perhaps of seasons and sources, just as an example. So we've got a nice flow there. Of course, that might be extended at GCSE and at level 3 A level or advanced higher in Scotland, with perhaps sustainability, environment, and other aspects too. So we can get clear routes of progression running through. Let's have a quick look at healthy eating. So again, what we have here is key stage 1, 2, and 3, just on one slide. Again, you can start to see some progression here. So key stage 1, we can see there it's about understanding the basic principles, but in order to prepare dishes. We've got the key words for key stage 2 and 3 is definitely the apply word. And there are some key clues here. So it's not good enough just to know. You've got to be able to do something with that knowledge and then interpret it and then justify your decisions as you go through in that application. So again, what would be our building blocks, just as an example? So perhaps we've got the thing about we all need food and drinks as we go through, and we need those food and drinks, in a healthy balance. So very kind of general. Some of those we need more than others. So, there's a 5-a-day message, and we shouldn't forget that, because in actual fact, not many of us are actually achieving 5 a day as we go through as a nation. We then have to have different types of foods in different proportions, which is what the Eat Well guide is showing most of the population as we go through. There are energy and nutrients that we need, and they're from different sources and have different functions, and we need them in different amounts. And this links back to the Eat Well guide about that balance and variety, because different foods provide different types of nutrients. So we need that variety and balance as we go through. And then moving through, there are different dietary needs and health aspects. So ages and stages and special diets that we also need to consider. So hopefully you can see here, as I'm mapping through my schemes of work, so very top line, I've got these key fundamental concepts, these building blocks, if you like, to run through. And then lastly, let's have a look at cooking. So again, we've got key stage 1, 2, and 3. And you can see here in the national curriculum, it is about, again, preparing dishes, but those dishes being predominantly savoury. I think you'd have to make a judgment call about what you think is predominantly savoury. That's an interesting one. I mean, fruit salad isn't, but I would suggest it's actually made. Also, we've got a repertoire of predominantly savoury. And then we've also got some other clues about feeding themselves and others, and about a range of cooking techniques too. So what does this mean? And this one I struggled slightly about key concepts. So what I've come up with are some very kind of linear thoughts as we go through. So if we think about our food skills, well, we want to introduce some very basic food skills to begin with. So that might be, for example, spreading or mixing or spooning, for example. And then over time, we want to extend those food skills, and we actually want them to practice those food skills in order to become more and more proficient at those different ranges of food skills that we introduce over time. If we think about equipment in the same way, we want them to use some basic equipment to begin with, So linking to the food skills, we want them to think about maybe using a spoon, using a butter knife, holding a bowl, perhaps using a very simple grater. And then again, the same principle that we wish to extend, use different types of pieces of equipment. So that's where we might get into a cooker, electrical tools. But again, it's about having practice in those in order to become proficient in their use. And those are not in any particular order, because we may use some simple electrical tools before the cooker and vice versa. So for example, we could use a rice cooker, which is very simple. We could use a toaster in a primary school classroom. So there are lots of things that we could think about, and it depends on our own food environment, so our food room or the primary school room, so what we can do, what we believe the pupils can actually use when well trained, obviously, too. I also want to introduce a thing here about making sure that those food skills as cooking is also about their accuracy and precision as they go through their learning journey in food. So perhaps when they're 5 years old, accuracy and precision is less so. I know that's definitely happened when I had my niece and nephew round who are 6 years old and cooking with me. But also then we need to consider that safety and hygiene. There's that complexity issue too. So there might be dovetailing, there might be lots of different aspects to a recipe going on, or a dish, or you've got accompaniments happening. And that will, as you go through the key stages and to GCSE, that will develop and become more complex. And then there's that combination of skills. So not just one, but you're demonstrating many different skills that perhaps makes that recipe more complicated, more complex as we go through. And lastly, within this, we also need to consider the Eat Well guide, so our healthy eating messages as we go through, the savoury aspect, variety in cuisines, creativity, and of course, we need to think about people, because we eat. And personally, I believe in enjoying food. And really what this leads to is we need to think about this helping us decide about what recipes we're going to select. So the recipe choice is there to support our learning objectives, not the other way round. So we don't just do sausage rolls or apple crumble because we've always done it, and that's a year 7 recipe. It's because they teach certain food skills, they've got that equipment, it's helping with accuracy, precision, safety and hygiene. It's part of our Eat Well pledge, variety and so forth as we move on. Here's just an example of something from our primary school resource, which I wanted to share with you because I think it's appropriate, obviously primary and secondary. And I've put the web link at the end of the presentation. And just to add that the presentation is available on the Food Fact of Life website. I'll give you some details at the end, so it's already available as a PowerPoint. But you can see here what we've done at BNF is to show this progression in food skills, and we've taken it one level. Think about, well, what types of ingredients, these are only examples, would we use and introduce, and how we would move those through, and what would they learn by doing that. We've also thought about tasting, so not quite sensory evaluation, but how we might push that forward too. We can then move that on to think about the equipment that we're using too. So actually specifying what we want to use, how that progresses through a primary school here. And then we've key linked it in also to the different skills that we believe are going to be covered. So we know about ingredients we'd like to use, we know about the equipment we'd like to use, and we know about the skills that we'd like to use. And therefore that helps us then to determine about the recipes that we might select. So here you can see also, we've also highlighted hygiene and safety, and then things about planning to cook, recycling, making, and then eating too. So I hope you find that useful. And again, the link is at the end of the session. Progression of food skills, though, can be quite complicated and really depends on the complexity of what you do. So, for example, here, I've got 3 examples. You can see I've got some bread rolls, In the middle, I've got a fruit plat, and at the end there, I've got a pizza. So, for example, my bread rolls, why am I doing it? Because it's about weighing and measuring, it's about mixing, it's about kneading, it's about shaping, and it's about baking. Okay, so I could add some more things in that, but top line, that's what I'm going to. To extend that, I'm going to do the same again. So I'm going to have all those food skills covered, but actually I'm also adding dried fruit, I'm mixing and spice, I'm platting, I'm glazing. So to me, that's an extension, that's more complex as we go through. And then the last one, the pizza, or perhaps a calzone, is as before, but also then perhaps I've really extended it and I'm getting them to make a tomato sauce or some sort of topping. I've got different vegetable preparation going on. I've got decoration and presentations are happening too. And then I've got maybe grating of cheese. So you can see I'm building up the skills. Equally though, perhaps pizza and the plat could change position because I might be using a jar of tomato sauce. The vegetables might be already prepared and the cheese might be already grated. And all I'm doing is literally sprinkling all those pre-made components back on top. So it really depends on the complexity of that recipe that you wish in order for you to determine your own progression of food skills as you go through. Another way to try and help to think about planning schemes of work too is to think about different themes for a year. So for example, it might help that if we put things from the familiar to less familiar as we go through. So help to put things into focus and put into context. So for example, that could be all about me, it could be then friends and family, and then it could be others. So things perhaps linking with dietary restrictions or concerns out of the home, for example. So what's in it, just generally as we go through? Some top line, so a key stage, the year group, how much time you've got in a scheme of work, a bit of an introduction on the main theme or the rationale. What are you hoping to do? Very top line. And you can see here, I've put onto the right here, the difference between an aim versus an objective. Because I don't know about you, when I was at teacher training college myself, writing these, it could be quite difficult as we got through. And then thinking about the learning outcomes and to think about what those are measurable too. So I want them to list the eat well food groups. I want them to adapt and follow recipes. I want them to describe and follow food hygiene messages as we run through there. Equally, I want to make sure that we're building on that prior learning, so that scaffolding that we mentioned earlier. I want to highlight key resources that I'm going to use, top line risk assessment. I would also look at maybe thinking about differentiated learning outcomes too. So, for example, all pupils in this scheme of work are going to have 10 hours of practical cooking. Most pupils are going to do that with skill and accuracy, making a range of dishes. And then some of them will independently, with more skill and accuracy, carry out those 10 hours. So you can see here, I've got some differentiation, but built into the same scheme of work as we've gone through. And obviously, we want to make sure there's the curriculum coverage with other areas of the curriculum, because I think we do a lot of embedding and applying the curriculum from other areas in food lessons too. Let's look at lesson plans. So here we've got lesson plans as part of the bigger plan as we go through. So how many lessons? Well, that's down to your school. But what sequence are they in? How do they build that progression that we've looked at earlier? And how do they recap and consolidate that learning as we move through? We also really need to consider aspects of the different pedagogy. So different teaching and learning styles that we're going to introduce as we go through, so that we vary up our teaching to make it interesting and exciting for our young learners. And the flow of the lessons over the year. And then reflecting back, are the lessons I've actually written, do they actually meet now the scheme of work as we've gone through? What happens if pupils miss a lesson? Is there a recap? Is there a pack for them to catch up? And what's our ratio between practical and theory lessons? Or is there? Are they all practical and theories built within that too as we go through? And what about assessment? as we put this through, because that needs to be part of our mechanism to check that we're meeting our stated learning objectives. And of course, they have to be very much interrelated as we move through here. When we look at practical lessons, we really also need to think about how do we decide what pupils make. So I talked earlier about the recipe not being decided first. It's about the learning outcomes, learning objectives that we go through. So we really do need to focus on those as we go through. We need to think about that progression. So we talked about that skills flowchart as we go through, and that appropriateness too for that year group, but also thinking about your room and the procedures, the pupils' motor skills, the use of their cooker, the types of cookers, the equipment, their accuracy, their time management or lack of as we go through. And what skills and knowledge is that recipe providing? Think about those different opportunities as we go through. And then also we need to think about across the scheme of work or across the key stage, what's our sort of ratio of savoury and sweet recipes? And are we actually really sort of teaching what we preach about a healthy, varied diet as we go through? And of course, there are some issues to do with cost here, and that's something that we've been made very, very aware of at BNF, and we're sort of considering what we can do going forward. I've talked a bit about effective pedagogy approaches, and here's some research that was published. It's available on government website, and they've addressed through research 9 key aspects. So one is about pupil voice, so enabling pupils to talk about their learning as they go through. It's also dependent on our behaviour as teachers about what we do, what we know, and how we act. We also need to involve that clearer thinking about those long-term goals as well as short-term. So we've talked here about our scheme of work, about our lesson plans, what happens on the here and now during that lesson. And then we've talked about that progression from key stages, that prior learning and those experiences too. And that scaffolding, so how we scaffold that pupil learning, so that introduction, that consolidation, the application of that learning as we go through too. Number 6 is about that range of techniques, the whole class, structured work and so forth. So there's different learning opportunities with different styles. We've got that higher order thinking, which we're going to come on to just in a sec. So making good use of that dialogue and questioning as we run through. We've got that embedment of assessment of that learning. And also we need to make sure that it's inclusive and it looks at that diverse range of needs of our different learners that we have in the classroom. So I think, embedding it back to the research, really showing what's effective is always good. And I think as food teachers, we're always pushing this and working really, really well. I mentioned Bloom, so just as this is a sort of an overview here, that here's some fantastic sort of graphic here, which is showing from the lower order thinking skills up to the higher order thinking skills. And what I like about this diagram is it's really giving us some really good keywords that we can use for either our schemes of work or our lesson planning. So that's great, and it's just wonderful just to have everything on one slide, which is fantastic. Also, just to make you aware that there has been some change in the Bloom diagram over the years. Basically, it's pretty much the same. Some things have just been tweaked slightly. And as you can see here, it's really gone from a noun to more active verb as we go through. Here's one that I really like, and it's useful again about remembering, understanding, applying, analysing, evaluating, and then creating. What a fantastic one for food in schools. Absolutely wonderful. And then moving more towards the end here, we also need to think about that range of activities that we talked about. And you can see here that a lecture, the reading, audio-visual and demonstration is very traditional, very passive. But when we move down into more active learning, the retention rates actually increase as we go through. And I really like about the discussion work, the practice by doing, and then pupils teaching other pupils. So that immediate use, teaching others, very high retention rate of knowledge and skills as we go through. The lesson plans, very simply, the structure here. So key stages, your numbers, the time you've got, the title, differentiation in lesson objectives. We've got an overview of the lesson, the time plan, resources, maybe homework and some extension activity too. And we've got examples of this on the Food Factor Life website that you can download, and edit and make your own as we go through. So really tonight, in summary, it's really about schemes of work and lessons about mapping out those key concepts. And I hope I've given you some ideas here, those food building blocks to support that progression as we go through. And it is very much about when we have these, we're creating, using, evaluating and updating them in that sort of cycle as we go through. When we have practical work, it's the focus on that learning objectives, not just the recipes. Well, of course, the recipe then becomes the vehicle to achieve our learning objectives that are stated. And I think really key, and which we've seen, is those different pedagogy approaches that we can go through, and considering those skills and knowledge, our teaching environment, and different learning styles too. And then lastly, thinking about examples from your own organisation and other schools and other organisations like DNF. But when you look at those, do make sure that you make them your own. And also your school may have a format that it prefers. So for example, my school wanted very detailed lesson plans, but equally there are some people doing the teacher toolkit 5-minute lesson plans. So you need to find what works best for you and what your school expects from you too. So here's a little list here of sources of further information that you could find information on. So obviously is the curriculum, competencies, the progression grid that I've mentioned there from Food Effective Life. There's different schemes of work and lessons that we've got too. The license to cook materials might be useful if those of you haven't seen those before. The teacher toolkit, the 5-minute lesson plans I've mentioned. And then the D&T Association has a number of progression frameworks, again, that might be useful to help you. So I hope that you found this evening useful. We've just run over very slightly by a few minutes. I hope it's giving you some thoughts to take forward when you're next looking at a scheme of work and lesson plans. Equally, I hope it might have sort of confirmed that you're doing a great job anyway. And I can see that Francis has been answering some questions as we go through. What we will do is we'll be asking you to complete a very short webinar evaluation. So when the webinar finishes tonight, you'll automatically be redirected to the webinar evaluation rather, when you click close. And then once you do that, you'll actually receive your certificate of attendance. So that'll be great if you could do that. We do have another series of webinars continuing this term. So the next one is in a couple of days, which is around growing potatoes on a small and large scale. That will be very useful for primary school teachers with grow your own potatoes. We have another one on Get Portion Wise on the 6th of March, which is looking at food portion work that was been done by the British Nutrition Foundation. And then on the 28th of March, we have Food Science in Action, which is being done by Barbara Monks, which I think will be very useful for those of you doing GCSE work too. There's a link there that will take you to that information. So I hope you found that useful. Please do keep in touch. And there's been a few questions. So I know about resources for Scottish teachers, for example. So Francis, thank you very much for putting your email address in there. So again, please do get in touch. We'll try and support as many as you possibly can. Again, hope you enjoyed this evening. Please do put a few comments in, or keep the text box open for a few minutes more. Other than that, have a good rest of the evening, and I hope to see you again soon here on the Food Effective Life webinars. Thank you. Good night.